Imagine a beautiful purple flower, soft petals, delicate shape, the kind of flower you might see in a wide open field and think, this is peaceful, innocent, almost poetic. But this flower is not innocent. This flower has been connected to wars, empires, addiction, medicine, colonization, global crime, billions of people. This is the opium poppy, a flower that carries both life and death inside it. From it, humanity extracted some of the most important painkillers ever discovered. Morphine, codeine, and other medicines have relieved the pain of millions around the world. But from the same flower, humanity created some of the most destructive drugs in modern history: heroin, addiction, black markets, empires fighting over trade routes, countries collapsing under the weight of a plant that looks too fragile to hurt anyone. I'm Rex, and today we're going to follow the story of opium, from ancient civilizations to the Opium Wars to Afghanistan, the country that became known as the center of the global opium trade. And this story begins thousands of years before modern drug cartels, before international smuggling routes, before the word addiction became a public health crisis. It begins at the beginning of civilization itself. Before we start, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and stay with me until the end, because this is not just a story about a drug. It is a story about how one flower changed the world. The opium poppy has been known to humans for thousands of years. Some historians trace its use back to ancient Mesopotamia, around 3400 BC, where it was valued both as a painkiller and as something that could alter the mood. The Sumerians reportedly called it something close to the plant of joy. And honestly, that name tells you almost everything about the tragedy of opium, because the same thing that gave people relief also pulled many of them into dependence. The Greeks knew it, the Persians knew it, ancient Egyptians knew it. Historical records suggest that Egypt imported opium from places like Cyprus, and from there the plant continued its long journey through medicine, ritual, trade, and abuse. In the ancient world, opium was used for pain, sleep, illness, and sometimes for calming people down. And yes, in some periods people even used it to calm crying children. Today that sounds shocking, and it should, but that is how powerful and misunderstood this substance was for most of human history. Then the plant began to travel. Alexander the Great's campaigns helped carry opium into parts of Iran and India. Later, Arab traders helped move it toward China. Slowly, quietly, and almost elegantly, the purple flower spread across continents. Most conquerors needed armies. Opium just needed trade routes. By the time we reached the 16th century, European physicians were experimenting with opium-based medicines. One of the most famous was laudanum, a mixture that became popular in Europe as a remedy for pain, sadness, insomnia, and almost anything else people wanted to treat. In an age before modern medicine, laudanum looked like a miracle. A few drops, and pain seemed to disappear. A few drops, and sleep became easier. A few drops, and grief became softer. But miracles sometimes come with hidden bills. People slowly began to understand that opium did not simply silence pain, it could also take control of the person using it. Then, in the early 19th century, a German pharmacist named Friedrich Serturner isolated morphine from opium. He named it after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. At the time, morphine seemed revolutionary. It was stronger, more precise, and more useful than raw opium. Doctors believed they had found a safer and more controlled way to fight pain. Some even treated it almost like a divine medicine, but there was a problem. Morphine was also addictive, because at the end of the day, it still came from the same flower. Then came heroin. In the late 19th century, chemists developed heroin from morphine. At first, it was presented by some as a medical breakthrough. In one of history's darkest ironies, it was even promoted as a possible treatment for morphine dependence. Think about that for a second. Someone walks into a doctor's office addicted to morphine, and the solution offered is another drug that later becomes one of the most addictive substances in history. That is not medicine. That is humanity learning the hard way. While scientists and doctors were experimenting with the medical side of opium, empires were discovering something else. Opium was profitable, very profitable, and this is where the story becomes political. In the 19th century, Britain became heavily involved in the opium trade, especially through India and China. China tried to restrict and resist the trade because opium was devastating its population and economy. Britain did not accept that resistance. The result was the First Opium War. China lost. The Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 forced China to pay heavy penalties and cede Hong Kong to Britain. Then came the Second Opium War, which again ended badly for China. This is one of the strangest and most brutal chapters in global history. A major empire forcing another civilization to accept a destructive drug trade because the profits were too valuable to surrender. So when people say opium is just a plant, they are missing the point. This plant helped reshape global power. By the end of the 19th century, countries finally began to realize that opium and its derivatives were becoming a disaster. Productivity was dropping, addiction was spreading, governments were worried. In 1909, the first major international anti-drug conference was held in Shanghai. For the first time, the world gathered to put the purple flower on trial. At that point, global opium production was enormous, and China was still one of the biggest centers of the problem. But here is the interesting part. Afghanistan, the country we now associate so strongly with opium, was not yet a major player. In fact, Afghanistan was not important enough in the global opium economy to be a central issue at that conference. So how did Afghanistan go from a relatively small producer to a country that, at one point, produced a huge share of the world's opium? To understand that, we need to understand Afghanistan itself. Afghanistan is a country with a geography that almost sounds like a curse. Many countries are proud of their location. They sit on a coastline, a trade route, a strategic passage, or a valuable border. Afghanistan has a strategic location too. The problem is that its location has brought it more pain than privilege. It is landlocked, meaning it has no access to the sea. That alone creates logistical, political, and economic challenges. But the bigger issue is where Afghanistan sits. It lies near China, Iran, Pakistan, Central Asia, and the historic routes connecting empires. For centuries, it was close to the paths of conquerors, traders, armies, and ideologies. It has been called the gateway to India. It sat near the ancient Silk Road, and whenever powerful empires wanted to move through the region, Afghanistan was often in the way. Alexander passed through. The Mongols passed through. Islamic civilizations rose through the region. Persian powers influenced it. Later, Britain and Russia fought over influence in the area during what became known as the Great Game. History did not simply pass by Afghanistan. History repeatedly stepped on it. In the 19th century, Britain wanted to prevent Russia from using Afghanistan as a pathway toward British India. To protect its empire, Britain tried to dominate Afghanistan. Afghanistan became a buffer zone in a global power struggle it did not choose. Then in 1919, Afghanistan won full independence from British influence under King Amanullah Khan. At first, Amanullah was a symbol of national pride. He wanted reform. He wanted education. He wanted modernization. He traveled abroad and tried to bring new ideas back to Afghanistan, but not everyone welcomed those changes. Many Afghans saw his reforms as too Western, too fast, and too disconnected from tradition. Political pressure, tribal resistance, religious opposition, and internal power struggles eventually forced him from power. And in one of those strange moments of history, he ended up exiled in Switzerland, from Afghanistan to Switzerland. As punishments go, that is almost suspiciously comfortable. In 1933, Mohammad Zahir Shah became king, and he would rule for nearly 4 decades. Many Afghans later remembered his era as a comparatively stable period. Afghanistan joined international institutions, gained wider diplomatic recognition, and tried to maintain neutrality during the Cold War. Zahir Shah did something extremely difficult. He received support from both the United States and the Soviet Union without fully surrendering to either side. Afghanistan was poor, but it was not yet completely broken, and opium production was still limited. In the mid-20th century, Afghanistan even introduced strict laws against opium cultivation and trade. Production remained relatively small compared to what would come later, but stability in Afghanistan rarely lasted. In 1953, Mohammad Daoud Khan became prime minister. He was ambitious, nationalist, and deeply focused on border disputes with Pakistan, especially over Pashtun areas divided by the Durand Line. His pressure on Pakistan created serious economic problems. Pakistan closed border routes, and Afghanistan's trade suffered. As the economy struggled, Afghanistan became more dependent on Soviet support. Eventually, Daoud Khan was forced to resign. Then, in 1973, while King Zahir Shah was abroad for medical treatment, Daud Khan launched a coup, abolished the monarchy, and declared Afghanistan a republic. He came to power with support from the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, a communist party with strong links to the Soviet Union. The communists called him the Red Prince, but Daoud did not want to become a Soviet puppet. He became nervous about Soviet influence and began reducing dependence on Moscow. He tried to build ties with Islamists, liberals, the United States, Iran, and Turkey. In other words, he used the communists to reach power, then tried to move away from them. That is not a strategy that usually ends peacefully. During this period, opium production began to rise slowly. It was still not at the catastrophic levels of later decades, but the warning signs were there. As neighboring countries like Turkey and Iran cracked down on opium, a gap opened in the regional market. Afghanistan began to fill it. Then came 1978. That year changed everything. A leading communist figure was assassinated, and the People's Democratic Party accused the government of being responsible. Protests erupted. The Sour Revolution followed. Daud Khan was killed, and the communists took power. Nur Muhammad Taraki became the first communist president of Afghanistan. He signed new agreements with the Soviet Union and began aggressive reforms, especially in agriculture and land ownership. But those reforms were implemented harshly and disastrously. Farmers rebelled, religious leaders resisted, tribal communities rejected the government's methods. In 1979, the Herat uprising exploded and Taraki turned to the Soviet Union for help. But even Soviet leaders initially understood the danger. Sending Soviet troops into Afghanistan meant fighting the Afghan people themselves, not some external enemy. That kind of war would not be forgiven. Still, the situation spiraled. Taraki's own ally, Hafizullah Amin, turned against him. Amin presented himself as a more acceptable figure to religious and nationalist forces, but he was also feared by Moscow. Power struggles turned violent. Taraki was killed. Amin took power. Then the Soviet Union intervened militarily, killed Amin, installed a new leadership, and triggered one of the most destructive wars in Afghan history. The Soviet-Afghan War lasted nearly 10 years. It devastated the country. Millions became refugees. Roads were destroyed. Agricultural land was ruined. Villages were emptied. Families were broken. And in that chaos, opium found the perfect conditions to expand. Think about the situation, a country where most people are farmers, a country at war, a country where legal markets are collapsing, a country with no strong central authority in many regions, a country where armed groups need money. Now imagine a crop that is easy to store, easy to transport, highly profitable, and always in demand. That crop was opium. For many Afghan farmers, it became survival, not luxury, survival. Wheat could rot, fruits could spoil, legal crops could be destroyed or fail to reach markets, but opium could be dried, hidden, moved, and sold. It became a kind of currency, a bank account that grew in the soil. During the war, the phrase opium for weapons began to describe part of the reality on the ground. Armed groups needed guns and supplies. Opium provided money. Between 1979 and 1989, opium production in Afghanistan grew rapidly. By the time the Soviet Union withdrew in 1989, Afghanistan had already been transformed. But the end of the Soviet war did not bring peace. Instead, Afghanistan entered civil war. Different factions fought for control, each believing it had earned the right to rule after resisting the Soviets. And every faction needed money, so opium continued to expand. By the mid-1990s, production had reached thousands of tons per year. Then, in 1996, the Taliban took control of Kabul. Their relationship with opium was complicated. For a time, they taxed it. They imposed religious taxes and other levies on the trade. The crop remained part of the economy. But in 2000, the Taliban banned opium cultivation and production dropped dramatically. For a brief moment, it looked as if Afghanistan might actually reduce its role in the global opium trade. Then came September 11th, 2001. Al-Qaeda was accused of carrying out the attacks, and because its leadership was based in Afghanistan under Taliban protection, the United States invaded. The Taliban government collapsed. A new political order was built under leaders like Hamid Karzai and later Ashraf Ghani. The United States had several major goals in Afghanistan: destroy terrorist networks, build a strong Afghan state and army, and reduce the opium economy that was feeding instability and flooding global markets. But the numbers tell a painful story. the attempt to control opium largely failed. Instead of disappearing, opium cultivation expanded again in many areas. By 2017, Afghanistan reached record levels of opium production, and in some years it accounted for the overwhelming majority of global supply. This was not just an agricultural issue, it became an economic system. Farmers grew it because they were poor, traffickers moved it because it was profitable, armed groups taxed it because they needed money, corrupt officials protected it because it paid, and ordinary Afghan families paid the price because opium did not only leave Afghanistan, it also stayed there. Addiction rates rose inside the country itself. Reports from the United Nations showed a terrifying increase in drug dependency among Afghans over the years. In 2005, Afghanistan had hundreds of thousands of drug users. By 2010, the number had reportedly doubled. By 2015, the crisis had grown even worse, with millions affected by addiction directly or indirectly. And the most heartbreaking part is the children. In some poor communities, children were exposed to drugs by addicted adults. Sometimes parents used substances to quiet hunger or calm distress, because poverty had become so brutal that even childhood was pulled into the crisis. That is the real tragedy. The opium poppy did not just fund wars, it entered homes, it entered families, it entered childhood. And here we return to the flower. The same flower that gave humanity morphine also gave it heroin. The same plant that eased pain also created pain. The same crop that helped poor farmers survive also trapped entire regions in dependence, conflict, and exploitation. Opium is not simply evil, and it is not simply useful. It is both. That is what makes it so dangerous. If it were only poison, humanity would reject it. If it were only medicine, humanity would celebrate it. But it is both medicine and poison, relief and ruin, a cure and a curse. And Afghanistan became the place where all of those contradictions collided. Geography made Afghanistan vulnerable. Empires made it a battlefield. War destroyed its economy. Poverty pushed farmers toward opium. Armed groups turned it into funding. Global demand turned it into an industry. And decades of conflict made it almost impossible to escape. So the real question is not, why did Afghanistan produce so much opium? The real question is, how could a country trapped in that much war, poverty, foreign intervention, and political collapse avoid becoming dependent on the one crop that still made money? And now the final question remains. Can Afghanistan recover? Can a country escape a flower that became part of its economy, its politics, its wars, and its pain? Can the purple poppy return to being just a plant instead of a symbol of suffering? No one can answer that easily. But if there is one thing history teaches us, it is this. A flower can be more powerful than it looks. It can heal. It can destroy. It can build fortunes. It can break nations. And sometimes, the most dangerous things in history do not arrive with armies, flags, or tanks. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in a field, on a stem, with purple petals. I'm Rex. If this story opened your eyes, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, do you think Afghanistan can ever fully escape the opium economy? And if you want more stories about history, power, disasters, and the hidden forces that shaped our world, stay with us. I'll see you in the next episode.